It's really a thrill to be here, and I appreciate all of you coming. My maiden speech to the 92nd Street Y was the State of World Jury address in 1981. It's a special pleasure to be here with David Rubenstein. I hired David in 1976 in the Carter campaign. He was my deputy for 4 years in the White House. And to see him blossom from a very shy, studious policy wonk into a patriotic philanthropist, the head of major organizations, NGOs, the Kennedy Center, the University of Chicago, Duke University, the Kennedy School, and so many other things, is really a thrill for me. And David, you honor me by your presence, and in between, he's had the time to write 5 books and build a giant financial firm. So thank you for coming. And I do want to also thank Susan Engel and Adine Eshman for their hard work on this. And having my son Brian and granddaughter Julia is a special thrill. We live in turbulent times where there are seemingly insoluble problems. And I wrote this book for 3 reasons. First, I wanted to show how over the past 50 years, U.S.-led diplomacy had been able to solve equally daunting challenges and can do so again. Second, at a time when we have hot wars in Gaza and Ukraine, and when in our own lifetime we've had a multiplicity of wars from Vietnam through Libya with very mixed results, I wanted to take a hard look at how military force can be used as a supplement to diplomacy, when and whether and under what circumstances. And third, at a time when there is a growing isolationism and nationalism in this country, I wanted to try to demonstrate through this book how U.S.-led engagement and leadership has created a better world, and that if we withdraw from that world and don't engage, we leave a giant vacuum into which the Russias and Chinas and others with very different values and interests will fill and create a much more threatening world for us, for our children, and for our grandchildren. The starting point for this book on the art of diplomacy is for the president to appoint the right negotiator at the right time. It's inconceivable that there would have been an opening to China without Henry Kissinger, or German reunification without Jim Baker, or the Camp David Accords without Jimmy Carter, or the Good Friday Agreement on Northern Ireland with George Mitchell, or the Dayton Accords on Bosnia without Dick Holbrooke. These and others that I highlight through 130 interviews brought a common set of skills to very different challenges. The first was the ability to seize an opportunity, to see a moment in time when you can leap and grab that and determine that you're going to succeed with it. The best example perhaps being George H.W. Bush when the Berlin Wall fell. Next is courage, not the courage of the battlefield, but the courage to take political risks, to break from the status quo, to break from your own political base, to grab peace. This happened in Northern Ireland with the Catholic and Protestant leaders, the Unionists and the Nationalists. It happened when Sadat went to Jerusalem. It happened more recently when the Crown Prince of the UAE decided, when his population would not have supported it, to make peace with Israel. Third is a high degree of intelligence combined with wisdom and good judgment. And Henry Kissinger is the perfect example of that, as was Zhou Enlai, his negotiating partner in the opening to China. Next is preparation, something that certainly David would understand as the most highly prepared person I've ever met. Preparation, preparation, preparation is essential to be able to see the areas for compromise. And the best example of that is that on the 13th and last day at Camp David, We were close to an agreement, but not there, and Begin said to Carter, I can't compromise anymore. I'm going home. Get a car for me to take me to Andrews Air Force Base for an El Al plane. And having prepared intensely and looked at his CIA reports, he knew that Begin had a great love for his 8 grandchildren, has 8 copies of the original photo made the first day at Camp David, addresses to each one of them by name to Jimmy Carter with hope for peace, takes it to Begin's cabin, sees Begin's eyes tear, his lips quiver, he puts his bag down and he says, I'll make another try. It's that preparation which was essential. Next is the ability to listen, not to yourself, but to the other side. How are they saying it? What are they saying it? Putting yourself in their shoes, because diplomatic negotiations are not a poker game. It's not a winner-take-all. It's got to be a win-win situation. It's what Larry Summers, my boss at Treasury when I was Deputy Secretary, called unsympathetic empathy. Next is developing personal relationships with your negotiating partner, not treating them as adversaries to be humiliated and defeated. The best example being Jim Baker taking Foreign Minister Shevardnadze from the Soviet Union to Jackson Hole, Wyoming, at a very difficult time in German reunification talks, and breaking down the bureaucratic barriers by spending 3 days with him at their retreat, talking about what would be best for world peace for their children and for their grandchildren. Next is creativity, and I call this the art of diplomacy because there is a creativity to it. And creativity is always essential because there will always be impasses in negotiations. So, for example, in the Good Friday Agreement, George Mitchell, the former Senate Majority Leader, is for 2 years negotiating. And there was such distrust between the Catholic and Protestant communities over their militias, who even during the negotiations were killing each other, that there was an insistence that they put their arms aside, and they wouldn't do it because of the mutual distrust. So he came up with something called the Mitchell Principles, namely, you don't have to drop your arms, but you have to sign an agreement that you're going to try to solve this problem by peaceful means. Next is sheer stamina. These negotiations are like marathons with a sprint at the end. You've got to have the stamina to keep going at 3 o'clock in the morning on the last day. And the whole term shuttle diplomacy came because Kissinger spent 2 weeks shuttling between Syria and Israel and Egypt to try to forge an agreement with almost no sleep. Jimmy Carter got maybe 3 hours of sleep in 13 days, and I got maybe 2 hours on a week at Kyoto. The next is don't swing for home runs. I'm using a baseball analogy for Baltimore Orioles that David owns. And that is, if you try to swing for a home run, you'll often strike out. Go for smaller agreements that you can build on. If you try for too much, you won't get anything. So at Camp David, Carter didn't solve the Palestinian problem. They weren't even there. But there's a peace with Egypt that's lasted for 40 years. Next is using a back channel. When two countries detest and distrust each other so much that they won't get in the same room, you need to have a back channel. So that was done by Yossi Beilin, a diplomat in Israel, to make the Oslo Accords work without the Prime Minister Rabin even knowing that that back channel existed. The next is not abandoning previous agreements just because you've defeated the person at the polls. So, for example, Reagan, to his great credit, although he wiped us out in the 1980 elections and campaigned against SALT, as David will remember, actually honored the SALT agreement because it was reached by a previous president. Contrast that with President Trump, who abandoned the nuclear agreement with Iran, and the roller coaster we have with climate change, where I negotiated Kyoto, depending on who was elected, we're either in or out. How can you negotiate with a country when you don't have a steady negotiating posture? Next is to have the confidence of the President and the White House staff. And here, Kissinger said, you might think I had a difficult relationship with Nixon, but I had total confidence in him and he in me. And the next is something we all know from our average lives, from business, from negotiating with our spouses or partners or children, and that's the ability to use leverage. Positive leverage, like an F-35 to the UAE when they were trying to normalize relations under the Abraham Accords, and negative leverage, economic sanctions, which are less effective now, and the ultimate leverage is military force. And with this, I'll conclude my opening remarks. Leverage on military force can be useful. We should not use our military force unless it is in the supreme national interest of the country, and we've exhausted every other means of doing so. And we have the following. First, accurate intelligence about an enemy's capabilities, their history, their culture, their internal politics, which we, by the way, rarely have. If we're going to use military force, use it with decisive force. That was the term that Colin Powell used. Bush 1 did that in the Gulf War. His son didn't do it in the Iraq War. Third, something the Israelis should have recognized. Link your military action to what you're going to have the day after the conflict, and do it before you shoot the first bullet. Have that political plan so you know, since military force is disruptive by definition, what you want coming afterward. And then back what you're doing militarily with economic and humanitarian support so that civilian non-combatants can see a better way of life. At the same time, with all of this, military force can backfire and produce worse results. As Mike Tyson, the former heavyweight champion, put it, everyone has a plan until they get punched in the mouth. My conclusion is to strengthen American diplomacy, you need to enhance our military and our economic capability. You need to nourish our democratic institutions. You need to reduce the bitter polarization so we speak with one voice abroad. There's no higher purpose than U.S. leverage of its greatest asset, and that is our values and our military and economic strength. And if we use those properly, we can engage with diplomacy, reduce conflicts, meet our 21st century challenges, and the alternative is a frightful one. Because again, if we withdraw, if we don't show leadership, if we give up on diplomacy, if we look only internally, we will have a more unstable and lawless world. So I'll look forward now to getting David's questions, and I want to say that we had one understanding, and that is David has sent me a list of very good questions, but one we've agreed not to go into is my golf handicap.
Stuart, you're roughly the same age as President Biden. If he decided not to run, would you consider running? I mean, you know, there's nothing wrong with being that age, right? So have you seen President Biden lately?
I did. In fact, I introduced him. I'm chairman of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, and I introduced him at the Yom HaShoah Remembrance Day celebration and commemoration at the U.S. Capitol just 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago.
So you're the chairman of the Holocaust Memorial.
I am, and for me it's life coming full circle, because you will remember, and you were very much involved in this, that I recommended to President Carter that he appoint a presidential commission headed by Elie Wiesel, who's such an institution at the 92nd Street Y, which, by the way, I have to say is the premier Jewish cultural institution, and maybe the premier cultural institution in the United States. And Elie was the chairman of the commission. We didn't know what they would recommend. We didn't know if it would be a statue, a monument. It was the museum. And now life coming full circle to be chairman of it has a special meaning.
How many people go a year to the Holocaust Memorial?
So this is quite remarkable. We did a recent survey, and since it opened in 1993, under President Clinton, it took that long to get the congressional authorization, which you and I helped draft and get the money raised. We've had almost 50 million visitors. We have more than 1,500 a day. 93% are non-Jewish. And when I see these young kids come in, particularly at a time we have rising anti-Semitism and Holocaust denial, and I see these young kids come in with their classes, it really gives me a very good feeling.
So you and I both came from blue-collar backgrounds, only children, Jewish, went to college in North Carolina, became lawyers, but your family was much more religious, I think, than mine. So when you grew up, you observed the high holy days, you went to observe the Sabbath and so forth, and you kept kosher?
We did not keep kosher, but we did have Shabbat dinners every Shabbat, and my father would take out his old Bible, his Chumash in Hebrew, and read the portion of the week and interpret it, and I remember him. And I, by the way, 4 times was confirmed by the Senate for positions in the Clinton administration. I used that old Bible to be sworn in on, and I remember him saying, as he went through some of the portions, let's see what Rashi has to say about this, who's a great commentary. But here's an important point, David, because you never know the path that life will take you. You wouldn't know that you would have been the head of Carlisle. So for example, I never met, growing up in Atlanta, to my knowledge, a Holocaust survivor. My father and both uncles were in the war. We never discussed the Holocaust. It was not a topic. I couldn't take it in high school or college because it wasn't offered. My epiphany occurred in 1968 when I was, after a year in the Johnson White House, I was working on the Humphrey campaign as his research director, and I met Arthur Morse, who was a co-worker, twice my age, and he had just published a path-breaking book called While 6 Million Died. And it used, for the first time, declassified Roosevelt administrations. And it showed what FDR knew about the genocide of the Jews and failed to act on. And it was an absolute shock to me because Roosevelt was an icon in our house, as he was, I think, in most Jewish homes. In fact, my father spoke very good Yiddish, and we said the Jews at the time believed in 3 things: Die Welt, this world; Jene Welt, the world to come; and Roosevelt.
Well, the whole Holocaust studies...
And I pledged to myself, this is what led me to help do this memo that you participated in. I pledged to myself that if I ever was in an administration, that I would do as much as I could to remove this cloud from the otherwise glorious history of the U.S. in World War II.
Well, the Holocaust studies movement really didn't start until the 60s. It was more than 15 years after the war ended. So for 15 years or so, many people just didn't want to talk about it.
Elie Wiesel told me, he wrote the foreword to my book, Imperfect Justice. He told me that it took him years to get an English publisher to publish his book, Night. Yitz Greenberg, Rabbi Irving Greenberg, who was the founder of Klal, said that he tried to teach at Yeshiva University in 1962 a course on the Holocaust and was told it wasn't a proper subject for academic study, and so he had to rename the program Totalitarian Systems of the 20th Century.
So can you explain to people, you seem like a very cerebral person, hardworking. Was it really true that you were an All-American basketball player?
I was All-City and Honorable Mention All-American in Atlanta, but with a giant asterisk, pre-integration. Okay.
So you tried to play at the University of North Carolina?
I wasn't. I tried, but I was a couple inches too short and not a step too slow.
Right. So,
but I could have. I was recruited at Penn. I think I could have played in the Ivy League, but I was very parochial at the time and wanted to stay in the South.
You should have gone to Duke. But anyway, okay. Let's go back to the book. So you're a serious lawyer. You're practicing at Covington and Burling. You're the chairman of the Holocaust Memorial Museum, and you've got a lot of other nonprofit things. How did you have time to write a book like this, which is very exhaustive, 130 interviews? When did you do that?
Of all the people who should be asking that question, it would be David Rubenstein.
Well,
David has invented the 25-hour day, and I have also found that time is elastic.
Okay.
If you are really devoted, you can segment things, you can get a lot done on weekends, at nights. If you don't need a lot of sleep, That helps as well. But I think really, to me, it's enriched life to have the kind of variety that I've had and that you've had as well. Dennis Ross and I chair the Jewish People's Policy Institute in Jerusalem. We find time to do everything and try to be prepared for everything.
All right. So it's widely rumored that Henry Kissinger died last year, but he wrote a foreword for your book. So how did that happen?
Henry, it's interesting. I interviewed Kissinger twice for this book, once on China, once on the Middle East, and then we tied in the negotiation that he had done on Vietnam. And I called him in his 99th year, and I said, you would do me a great honor if you would write the foreword to this book. And I said, I'll make it easy for you, I'll send you a summary. And he said, I'll write the foreword, but I don't want a summary, I want to read the book.
Okay.
And he wrote it, and I've always said, if no one wants to read my book, you should read his foreword. It's one of the last things he wrote, and it's a foreword on the importance of diplomacy.
So if you had a diplomatic matter, let's suppose you were President of the United States, and you had a diplomatic matter of some consequence to have resolved, who would be the one diplomat you would pick to do that? Would it be Henry Kissinger, Jim Baker, George Shultz, somebody else?
There are a lot of, again, I interviewed 130 officials, some great diplomats, some great generals. I have a whole section of my book on the use of war as a diplomatic instrument. But it would clearly be Kissinger, David. And the reason I say that is that he had a breadth of knowledge. He had a capacity to fit pieces together. He had a negotiating style, and he mentioned that his negotiating style was to always say what his goal was and what the goal of the negotiation should be. He had a capacity to put himself in the other's shoes. Let me give you an example. After the 73 Yom Kippur War, the Israelis, who were flat on their back, and Nixon and Kissinger deserve great credit for rearming them, had then turned the war around, and they had Egypt on the run. They had encircled the Third Army and could have crushed the heart of Sadat's army. What did Kissinger do? And this shows his brilliance as a negotiator and his ability to look beyond the immediate moment. He convinced Golda, and it was not easy, not to exterminate the Third Army. And the reason was, he said to her, if we humiliate Sadat by terminating their army, you'll never get peace with Egypt. Look, Golda, beyond the immediate military victory to what your real goal is, which is peace with Egypt. We won't achieve it if you annihilate them. And he had that great capacity to look beyond the moment and to convince people. And he would go between Sadat, between Begin, between Golda Meir, and really understand what each needed.
Okay.
So without question, he did. And let me just mention on China, he did not know hardly anything about China, except that he wanted to separate them from the Soviet Union. He was a European expert. That's what he taught at Harvard. He talked about the balance of power going back to, the Vienna Convention. But he studied Chinese history. He studied its culture. And he told me something very interesting. He said, when you negotiate with the Soviets, they have an agenda. They don't deviate from the agenda. They go right through the agenda. With Zhou Enlao, I didn't have an agenda. And I wanted to get right to the point. And then I realized, I said, wait a minute, that's not the way they negotiate. Zhou Enlao wanted to show him around the Forbidden City. He wanted to talk about Chinese culture and Chinese history. And Kissinger understood that you have to negotiate with different countries in different ways.
So, talking about that for a moment, whose idea was it to open to China, the Western world? Was that Nixon's? Was it Kissinger's? What was the nature of the rivalry? And how did Kissinger sneak into China, negotiate a pre-Nixon visit without the world knowing about it?
So Nixon and Kissinger came to this separately at almost the same time. Let's remember, and this is what's remarkable about the confidence that Nixon had in him and appointed him as his national security advisor initially. He was Nelson Rockefeller's advisor in the quite bitter primary between Rockefeller and Nixon. And he had written for Rockefeller a piece talking about the need to open to China. At the same time, Nixon in 1967 had written a piece in Foreign Affairs saying we need to open to China. Why? For two reasons. First, we couldn't isolate a country with 1 billion people. And second, and Nixon fit this into a Cold War context, we're in the middle of the Cold War, we need to find a way to separate the two communist giants, to get in between them. Now, unfortunately, we're in a situation where we sort of push them both into each other's arms. So they both came to that. Now, on your second point, Kissinger was so well known at the time, he tried every means possible, including at cocktail parties with third parties, to go up to an ambassador and say, you know, the U.S. would really like to talk to you guys. It took him a year. In the end, the way he snuck in to China was through Pakistan and using the plane of the Pakistani president.
Right. So for the last 10, 20 years or so, or 30 years, we've said the opening to China was a great thing for the United States and for the world. But looking at it selfishly as Americans, would we be better off if China had not emerged into the Western world? They were poor. They didn't have a lot of weapons to threaten us. They weren't economic or technological rivals. Are we as Americans better off for the Chinese being where they are today, or would you be better off if Nixon and Kissinger just went about their business and didn't open China?
No, the answer is no. They would have risen in any event. Better to have as many ties with them as possible. And let me give you a humorous anecdote. David, again, was part of this. So Nixon and Kissinger opened to China, but they didn't normalize. They didn't establish formal diplomatic relations because there was a very powerful Taiwan lobby in the Republican Party that was opposed to it. We did that in the Carter administration. We actually normalized relations. And here's the anecdote. We're in the cabinet room, and Deng Xiaoping comes in. He's 4'11", and my first notion was to say, how does a little guy like this control 1 billion Chinese? So he sits at the cabinet table, and he thanks the president for this historic opening, the first time since the end of World War II that we're establishing diplomatic relations. And he says to the president, Mr. President, I really appreciate this, but what we really need now is to build our economy up. And in order to do that, we need what's called most favored nation treatment, namely that you would lower your tariffs on Chinese goods to those you give to your closest allies. And he says, I know that there's a problem with doing that because of the so-called Jackson-Vanik Amendment after Henry Jackson and Charlie Vanik. But that was aimed at the Soviet Union, and it's said that the Soviets couldn't get that favorable treatment because they restricted the emigration of Soviet Jews. And he says to Carter, we don't restrict the number of Chinese. And he pushes a little piece of paper over with the White House, Washington, and a pencil over to Carter. And he says, write on here the number of Chinese you'd like us to send you each year. 1 million, 10 million, 20 million? And Carter laughs and says, I'll tell you what, we'll make a deal right now. I will take 10 billion Chinese a year if you'll take 10,000 American journalists. But the point is that it would have been a huge mistake not to do so. And look, there's no question, but the current president of China, Xi Jinping, is a very tough guy. He's aggressive. The Belt and Road Initiative, the buildup of their military, the militarization of the South China Sea, cyber warfare. He's a very tough guy. But if we treat China purely as an enemy, they will be an enemy. We need to find ways on climate change, on pandemics, and on the economy, where we work together. I mean, your firm has investments in Chinese companies. We need to create the kind of economic linkage. We have a $500 million trade relationship with China. That's important to China. We have invested $120 billion a year of American companies in China. So we need to keep that kind of linkage because the bilateral relationship between the U.S. and China will be the most important in the 21st century, diplomatically, politically, militarily.
So one time I was chairing a Tsinghua University economic School of Management board, and unbeknownst to us, they said a Chinese leader was going to come in and meet with us, and it turned out to be Xi Jinping. So as the head of the group, I'm sitting there, Xi Jinping sitting there, and I never met them before. I don't know what am I going to say to the president of China. So I started by saying, something like a trip of 1,000 miles begins with the first step. And that's an old Chinese saying. He said, no, that's an American fortune cookie statement. Anyway, so the greatest tour de force, and your book mostly covers, I would say, post-1950, would you say, diplomatic things. So the greatest tour de force in American diplomacy was, I would say, there are three great ones I would mention, but I don't know what your view would be. One would be the opening to China, which is historic, as we discussed. The second might be what Jim Baker did with George Bush in both kind of getting the Soviet Union to collapse, uniting Germany, or you could say what they did with respect to the war in Kuwait, incredible diplomatic achievements. But maybe the singular most impressive one is Jimmy Carter spending 13 days at Camp David. He wasn't an expert in the Middle East. He spends time with these two people, Sadat and Begin. You were involved in that to some extent. Did you tell Carter this is a crazy thing to do, and did you ever think it was going to fall apart and ruin his presidency?
So let's put this in context. I mentioned, in terms of skills, courage. Sadat showed enormous courage in going to Jerusalem and pledging no more wars. He lost his foreign minister over that, and he lost a second foreign minister at Camp David because he believed he was conceding too much. So he goes to Jerusalem, talks to the Knesset, no more wars. Then bilaterally, the Israelis and Egyptians try to flesh that out. What does no more wars mean? How do you concretize that? And they fail. And Sadat was so frustrated at Begin, he said to Carter, I'm going to withdraw from these talks. There's no progress we can be made. So Carter here really shoots for the moon, and he decides that this would be a catastrophe. It would leave Sadat coming home empty-handed, and he invites him over the objection of all of us. Every single person said, don't invite him to Camp David. It'll fail. It'll be egg on your face. It'll wreck your presidency. He said, this is the only chance we have. So what happened for 13 days and nights, and includes so many of the factors that I mentioned in my book. Number one, the courage to bring them. Number two, the preparation, which I'll get to in a minute. Number three, establishing personal relationships. So early on, he drives both of them in the presidential limousine to nearby Gettysburg battlefield to emphasize what wars will mean at the end. There's a need to end no more wars. And at that battlefield, Begin is so inspired, verbatim, he gives the Gettysburg Address. Okay, another personal touch. He has the first and only kosher Shabbat dinner for Begin and his delegation at Camp David. By the way, about the only person who was kosher was Begin. The others wished it wasn't kosher, but that's another story. Okay, so then Carter drafts 22 agreements and shuttles between Begin and Sadat, realizes that Begin will not agree to that, goes around Begin to his foreign minister, Dayan, to his defense minister, Weizmann, and to his legal advisor, Aharon Barak, and negotiates the agreement with them. But then you get to the point that I just mentioned in my opening, about Begin coming, saying, I can't make any more concessions, I'm leaving. And that's why his preparation, knowing his love of the grandchildren, made a difference. Now, one thing that's also ignored, everybody focuses on Camp David. Camp David was a diplomatic triumph, but it was a legally non-binding framework. It was not a treaty. It called for a treaty within 3 months between Israel and Egypt. 3 months pass, 4 months pass, 5 months pass, 6 months pass, no treaty. Here Carter again, and I assure you, over every single advisor, decides to go to the region and do shuttle diplomacy to see if he can make a treaty out of the Camp David Accords. He spends 3 days, and they get close, but they're not there. He changes, he's staying at the presidential suite at the King David Hotel. Air Force One is refueled. The airspace is cleared. All the staff, except a few, are gone, going to Ben Gurion Airport. We get a call from Begin saying, I'd like to see the president early in the morning, the last day. Well, we figured he just wants to say, thanks for coming. Sorry it didn't work out. Carter then redresses and says, entertain the prime minister until I get back on my suit and tie. And Begin says, now boys, you know, this is a famous hotel, the King David Hotel. Yes, we know that. Not for the reason you think. When I was head of the Irgun, I blew this hotel up with the British in it. Don't worry, I'm not going to do it while the president's here. He goes up to the presidential suite. That's where they seal the treaty. They come down, famous King David Hotel. The elevator breaks between the first floor and the lobby. The Secret Service has to pull them each out butt first, and I call it the breech birth of the treaty.
So, well, incredible diplomatic coup, because that agreement, that treaty is still in effect 40 years later.
40 years later, under the most difficult circumstances, several wars in Gaza, several wars in Lebanon, the Gaza war right now, where I was in Egypt after the war started. I can tell you public opinion in Egypt is hugely against it. And yet, President Sisi has kept the treaty. They're cooperating. They have a common enemy in Iran, for sure. But that treaty has held under the most difficult circumstances.
Now, Stuart, you worked for President Carter. You were very close to him. And by the way, on Camp David, for those people who haven't been at Camp David, I assume most people who haven't probably spent a lot of time in Camp David. What's it like there? Is it like the Ritz-Carlton, very fancy, or what's up there?
It was created by Dwight D. Eisenhower out of what had been a very rustic retreat. He recreated it, put in bike paths, heated the homes, the little shelters, the lodges, which are still quite primitive. Has a tennis court, a little putting green that he used because Eisenhower was, and named it after his grandson, David, his first grandson. That's where he got the name Camp David. It is a rustic luxury. By that I mean it is nothing like a swank hotel. It is lodges. Carter invited the staff up many times. We spent maybe a dozen weekends there. My son Brian was there. It has wonderful service. You can get any movie you want. Carter was so kind that he actually had my kids jog with him. I played tennis with him once. We played doubles. He lost the first set. He says, let's make it 2 out of 3. He lost the second set. He said, let's make it 3 out of 5. But the reason why it was selected for what became the Camp David Accords is because he could keep the press out. He knew that if you had it in Washington or any capital, the leaks that would occur playing to your home audience wouldn't work. Now, it almost didn't happen at Camp David because he was a penny pincher. And when he first came in, he made the huge mistake of selling the honey fits, the sequoia. I know Jillian Sorensen is here, Ted's widow. He sold it, which was ridiculous. It was the best lobbying device going up and down the Potomac. He wanted to sell Camp David. And Rosalynn said, you may need it someday.
So the reason presidents like it, I assume, is that they can walk around without the Secret Service being 3 feet behind them. They're more or less free to kind of do what they want because it's protected.
Yes, I mean, you have the military. It's an enormous complex. The Marines have a little base there, and they use a separate pool. So it gives complete privacy with wonderful service.
Okay. So you worked for President Carter, but you also worked in several positions for President Clinton and for President Obama. So of those 3 presidents, Carter, Clinton, and Obama, who's the smartest?
So if you gave an IQ test, and I'm not trying to hedge and be diplomatic, you would find that they're all in the 99th percentile. I mean, after all, Barack Obama was president of the Harvard Law Review, Bill Clinton was a Rhodes Scholar, and Jimmy Carter was near the very top of the Naval Academy. But there's a difference between being brilliant and being effective. And here, I think the contrast would be as follows. If you gave Jimmy Carter a task like the Egypt-Israel peace agreement, like the SALT agreement, which he negotiated, like the Panama Canal Treaty, he would do brilliantly at it. But he didn't like politics, he didn't like policy, he didn't like compromise, he didn't like the give and take, and he didn't connect all the dots of issues. So, for example, at the very beginning, as a way of saving money, he wanted to end what are generally wasteful water projects, these huge dams and so forth, which cost billions of dollars and don't have a good return on the taxpayer's dollar. But he didn't realize by taking 18 of them on, he was going to offend what we used to call the bulls, the people who headed the appropriations committees, who would be important for him on other legislation. Clinton, on the other hand, made those political connections. He loved politics, he loved politicians. Now, Jimmy Carter also was a stickler for detail. He literally would send my memos in, which you always reviewed, with circles around grammatical mistakes and misspellings.
Right. He hated split infinitives, and you'd have to redo the memo if you had a split infinitive.
And he would always ask for the appendix to the memorandums. So Clinton didn't do that. Also, Carter worked on what we called Carter time, which was Navy time. He was a submariner and the Rickover Navy. If a meeting started at 4 o'clock and you came at 4:01, you got a very severe stay. On the other hand, Clinton had what was called Clinton time. If a meeting started at 4 o'clock, it actually started at 5 o'clock. And in part, that was because he loved people so much that he would relate in the previous meeting to them and you couldn't pull him out. Obama had more of Carter in him than he did Clinton. I don't think he liked the give and take of politics. I don't think he liked politicians. I don't think he liked working with, but he was effective. But again, I think there was more of Carter's way of dealing with the presidency than there was Clinton's.
So the first United States senator to endorse Jimmy Carter for president of the United States in 1976 was Joe Biden.
That's correct.
So you presumably have known Joe Biden for 40 plus years
I
or so.
have.
So tell us about his intellect compared to the other three.
Well, he didn't go to Harvard Law School.
Right.
He wasn't a Rhodes Scholar, but he had great political instincts. I think certainly the equal of Bill Clinton's. He loved politicians. He was in the Senate for decades. He served 50 years. He understood how politics worked. Okay. So while perhaps from a pure intellectual standpoint, he wasn't in the same category, from a political standpoint, he's right at the top.
So in your book, you talk about something where you have been involved as a diplomatic leader for the United States, which is to get, I guess, redress of stolen property from Holocaust victims. Can you tell us how you got involved in this issue? Who asked you to get involved with it? And what has been your recovery effort so far? How successful have you been in recovering stolen assets?
Well, between the recoveries that I got, $8 billion in the Clinton administration when I was his special representative and negotiated with the German and Austrian slave labor companies, the Swiss and French banks, the European insurers, art restitution, and what I've done as a pro bono negotiator for the Jewish Claims Conference, including most recently last month with the Germans, we've gotten $17 billion. So our most recent budget for fiscal 25 for the Germans is $1.5 billion. That's for home care for survivors, that's for special pensions, that's for supplemental payments, that's for education. Now, the way I got involved in restitution...
You get a carried interest on the money you get back?
If I got a percentage, I'd be in your category, David. And maybe I would own the Orioles. I got involved in an unusual way. I mentioned my experience with Arthur Morse, which is why I wrote the memo on the Holocaust museums. So I'm in Brussels now, ambassador to the European Union, and I got a call from Richard Holbrooke, who was then Assistant Secretary of State. He's the same one that negotiated the famous Dayton Accords on Bosnia. And he said, communism is now over. The small remnants of the Jewish communities in Europe are being restored, but they have no infrastructure. The Nazis destroyed their synagogues. What were left were communized and nationalized by the communists during the communist era. Edgar Bronfman has just, who's the head of the World Jewish Congress, come to see President and Mrs. Clinton, and they want you, in addition to being ambassador to the EU, to be a special negotiator on these issues. My entire staff at the European mission to the U.S. mission to the European Union said, there's no way you can do this. You've got a full-time and a half job as ambassador to the EU. And I went home that night to Fran, and she said, remember the pledge you made to Arthur Morse? You've got to take it. And so I said to next morning to Holbrooke, I'll take it, but how long will this take? He said 3 months. Well, I'm now in my 20th year. But it was because of that commitment I made to myself to remove the cloud that I've continued to do it.
So we've talked about great American diplomats, Baker, Kissinger, others. Who was the most impressive diplomat post-World War II from a foreign country that you've ever read about, known about, or negotiated with?
Without question, it was Tony Blair, the three-time Prime Minister of the UK. So let me put you in the picture with the Good Friday Agreement. The British, in British understatement, called the civil war between the nationalists and unionists, the Catholics and the Protestants in Northern Ireland, the Troubles. Well, the Troubles killed 3,500 people and maimed over 10,000. And it was vicious. Here's where individuals and diplomacy come into effect. Bill Clinton showed courage in the following way. He issued a visa for the head of Sinn Féin, which was aligned with the IRA, one of the worst terrorist groups, to come to the United States. And I interviewed Jerry Adams for this book, and he said that visa gave me credibility. It made me realize that I needed to convince the IRA to put their arms down and negotiate. So Clinton was critically important. Tony Blair and Bertie Ahern, who were the prime ministers of the Irish Republic and the UK, were elected at the same time. What Blair did was also courageous. The Labour Party position had been for decades that there should be no negotiation with anyone associated with the IRA and with terrorist groups. He broke that down.
Okay.
He and Bertie Ahern. He showed the courage to negotiate, and he supplemented what George Mitchell did as mediator. One last point, which makes another point that I make in my book, which is don't always go for home runs. So at the Good Friday agreements, named because they ended at Good Friday, Tony Blair had a choice to make. Does he accept an imperfect agreement or take what was on the table? Why was it imperfect? There were two big issues over Northern Ireland. Should Northern Ireland be part of the Irish Republic in the south, where it had broken off from 100 years before, or should it be part of Great Britain? That was finessed by saying there should be an ultimate referendum. Let the people of Northern Ireland decide. That referendum has never been held because there's enough confidence now by the Catholic and Protestant communities. And the second was, what do you do about the militias, about the armed militias? That was not resolved in Good Friday. It took 9 more years for Blair to get the decommissioning. So he, to me, was the most impressive foreign figure.
In the United States, we've talked about some great diplomatic coups. What is the worst example of diplomacy you've seen in the United States government post-1950?
So there were two that compete, that are really neck and neck. The first was the Second Iraq War under President George W. Bush. He forgot all the lessons of his father. Instead of using decisive force, he divided our forces between Iraq and Afghanistan and used what his Secretary of Defense called a light footprint rather than Colin Powell's decisive force. Second, and this is one of the things I found out about in my book, before you go to war, you need good intelligence. They went to war under the supposed notion that there were weapons of mass destruction that Saddam Hussein had. We all know that there weren't. What we don't know, and what I disclose in the book, is why. And here, Steve Hadley, who was a national security advisor, who I interviewed, and Condoleezza Rice, the Secretary of State of Bush, too, were very candid. This is a great and tragic irony. And that is, yes, there were no weapons of mass destruction when the war started. But why? It wasn't that Saddam didn't have them, he did have them. But unbeknownst to the CIA and MI6 in Great Britain and the German intelligence, he had actually destroyed them in compliance with the UN resolutions. But he wouldn't admit that he had destroyed them publicly because he was afraid it would make him look weak at home and would make him look weak to the Iranians who might invade. So that tragic mistake of not admitting that he had done the right thing ended up costing his life, cost the lives of several thousand U.S. soldiers, and embroiled Iraq in a war, a civil war, in which in part it's still involved with in 2024.
And the other one?
And the other one we were involved with. And here...
This is Iran?
This is the Carter negotiation.
And not the domestic policy people. We weren't involved in this part, right?
That is correct. So, the hostage crisis. We had the worst intelligence in modern American history. Just as bad as the one with weapons of mass destruction. Why? The Shah of Iran was the favorite of 6 presidents, Republican and Democrat. He had an open shopping list for any arms he wanted. 6 weeks before he leaves Iran ignominiously, the CIA reports to Carter, I have the memorandum, it's in my book, and they say to the President of the United States, Iran is neither in a revolutionary nor even in a pre-revolutionary state. They didn't realize that his support was on quicksand. They didn't realize that our principal ally in the region had incurable cancer. So absolutely horrible intelligence. Second, once the hostages were taken, and they were taken because Carter believed that the government, the radical government, would protect our embassy, as they did in February of '79 when the first effort was made, and the new government of Iran did protect them. He felt he had an assurance that they would. And once the hostages were taken, here was the big question. And I want everybody to understand that military force and diplomacy are not polar opposites. They can be combined. So at the first meeting of the National Security Council in the Situation Room, not Wolf Blitzers, the Situation Room in the White House, I said, we should remember what President Kennedy did at the Cuban Missile Crisis. We should blockade a place called Karg Island, which is the island off of the coast of Iran, where 60% of their imports come, and show him that we mean business. We didn't do it. They were afraid, the president and his political advisors, that they would assassinate the hostages. I said, there's no way they will do that. If they do that, they know that will be World War III. It'll be the end of their regime. But that is what prevented it. So we didn't have the kind of military force that gave us the leverage. In addition, and this was something I did have a role in, and that is the economic sanctions. We could not get our allies to join us in really tough economic sanctions. They kept buying oil from the Iranians, so the Iranians didn't feel the squeeze of economic sanctions.
So we have a number of really good questions that have come in from people here. Unfortunately, they're better than my questions, and I won't have time for them all, but let me give you a few of them. How can you tell when someone is negotiating in bad faith, and how do you respond?
So one of the things that I mentioned of being really a good negotiator is knowing the difference between when somebody is talking by their talking points, and we have our talking points too, when they're stating their maximum position, and when it's really a red line. And the way to determine that is to develop these personal relationships. It is to develop at coffee breaks, in a hotel room, in private discussions, where you get away from the formality of the negotiating situation, where you get the key negotiator away from his own delegation, where they have to show that they're being tough, to find out what their real bottom line is. And you can begin to share what your real bottom line is, and you see if there's a bridge between them. Now, one of the tragedies in the Middle East is that while Israel has reached agreements for peace with Egypt, with Jordan, with the UAE, with Morocco, with Bahrain, and they would have with the Saudis, and they will with the Saudis. With the Palestinians, there's simply a bridge too far at this point. Each claims the maximum for the other. But again, the direct answer to your question is you do it by personal encounters, by breaking down the formality of the actual negotiations. And that's what George Mitchell also did. He immediately broke down the negotiations from one huge table with 13 political parties and met separately with each so that he could really begin to understand what the genuine red line, what the genuine bottom line was for the parties.
So would you comment on your reaction and follow-up to the Turkish ambassador who threatened that he could not promise safety to Turkish Jews if the U.S. Holocaust Museum mentioned the Armenian genocide?
Yes, so I was directly involved with this. The Turkish ambassador came to see me, and they said that's exactly what he said. And we had an Armenian person on the Presidential Commission who, it turns out, had come onto the commission because he wanted the Armenian genocide to occur, to be mentioned. And the only reference in the Holocaust Museum to this day on the Armenian genocide is that there is, and I saw it just within the last 2 weeks when I took a foreign guest through, it's when the final solution is determined at Wannsee in 42. It was that late. It's really important to understand, I'm sorry for the brief diversion, that Hitler's original plan was not the final solution. It was to make Germany Judenrein, to get the Jews out of Germany, and that's the tragedy of the Avion Conference, where we refused to amend our immigration laws, where the other countries didn't. But again, to get back to this, the only reference is it says that when the final solution was presented to Hitler, and he agreed in 42, one of the persons said, Führer, if we do this, it will be a stain on German history for 1,000 years. And he said, no, no one remembers the Armenian genocide.
So here's an easy one. What should the U.S.'s role be in ending the current conflict in Israel and Gaza?
It should be just what we're doing now. We should be engaged. We should be acting as a back channel with Hamas and with Qatar and with Egypt. We should be pushing the Israeli government to do what they have not done, what they should have done, which is one of the lessons that I mentioned, that before you shoot the first bullet, know what the political outcome is. To this day, and it's the reason that Benny Gantz left the War Cabinet, we do not know what the Israeli government wants to have as the final negotiating solution, the final governance solution in Gaza, and we should keep pushing them while at the same time we support Israel. We make it clear that we're going to support them in every way through military means, but we should continue to engage and we continue to peace. What I'm really concerned about is that if after the election we take a general hands-off for everything, for NATO, for the European Union, for Ukraine, and for the Middle East, we will create a vacuum in which we will not be able to really resolve this issue.
So what do you attribute the rise of anti-Semitism, which is obviously occurring in the United States and Europe and other places?
So I wrote a book based actually on my lecture here on the state of the world jury. And so I follow these Pew Center polls, which are the best. The level of anti-Semitism pre-October 7th was around 12 to 13%, meaning that percentage of the American public held at least one of the 6 anti-Semitic tropes. Jews have too much power, too much influence, too much money, they're clannish, and so forth. What's happened since, so there has been this 12, 13%. What's happened with anti-Semitism since then is that it had been previously the domain of the far right. It's what we saw at Charlottesville. What's happened now with the far left is a conflation of Jews and Israel. And that's the real danger, is that we're getting hit from both sides. And what I wish we could say to these kids, and I went, may I say, since we're in New York, Brian and I went, my son who's here, we went before the second Seder to Columbia to see for ourselves what was happening. We got in because there was a professor of journalism who got us in. And he told us about what the kids were doing. And I only wish we could show them the following. Number one, 1937, the Peel Report, there should be a Jewish and a Arab state. 1947, the UN itself, which they hold in such great repute, creates out of the British mandate an Arab state and self-stated in the resolution a Jewish state. The Arabs reject it and go to war. Okay, fast forward to Camp David. No Palestinians at Camp David, not one. We begged Arafat to come and accept UN Resolution 242, Land for Peace. He refused. So there were no Palestinians. The best we can come up with is full autonomy. Okay, fast forward to Camp David 2. Clinton, Barack, and Arafat. Proposal for 95% of the West Bank to go for a Palestinian state. The other 5% to be made up was by Israeli territory in Sinai. And East Jerusalem, David, is the capital of a Palestinian state. Rejected by Arafat, who I had met with just a few weeks before, and he told me, don't invite me to Camp David because I'm not ready to compromise. And the second Intifada happens. Okay, fast forward to 2009. Prime Minister Olmert offers Abbas, the current president of the Palestinian Authority, who's in his 16th year of a 4-year term. And he says it's 96% of the West Bank, the other 4% from the Sinai, 50,000 Palestinians coming back, families for a reunion, East Jerusalem as the capital, rejected. 2005, Aric Sharon, Prime Minister of Israel, real hawk, decides that having people in Gaza is a loser. And what does he do? He removes every single IDF soldier from Gaza. Not a one is left. And I wish we could show this video to every one of these college students. Kicking and screaming, and they were, he pulls out 7,000 Israeli settlers. 0 were left. And they left the greenhouses, and they left the infrastructure for the Palestinians. Hamas wins the election in 2006, takes over in 2007, and starts sending rockets instead of roses back. Let me give you what could have been. I was there in 2000, July of 2000. I was then Deputy Secretary of the Treasury, and I was responsible as President Clinton's Special Representative for Middle East peace, for the economic dimension. And here's what I saw in Gaza myself, July of 2000. We had gotten Congress to create something called the Qualifying Industrial Zone legislation, so that if you had as little as 10% Israeli content in an industrial zone, like in countries that had peace agreements with Israel, at that time it was just Jordan and Egypt and the Palestinian Authority, you could ship back duty-free,
Right.
zero duties, to the United States. And here's what I saw. 30 plants in Gaza, not Israeli plants, not a one was an Israeli plant. Japanese plants, Singaporean plants, European plants, American plants, using like unprocessed Israeli cotton for their 10%, employing 1,200 Gazans. I saw a second phase being built with another 30 plants. And I went into one of the plants and I saw the products being loaded onto a flatbed truck going right through the Eretz crossing that we see on TV right now to the airport that we got the Corps of Engineers to build for Palestine exports. It was a beautiful thing, and one unarmed Israeli soldier. One unarmed Israeli soldier. And that's what could have been. That's what might have been. That's what we have to somehow get back to.
So, do you think that if people buy and read your book, they will live longer? There's a special place in heaven reserved for them? They'll be a better human being? What would you say would be the results of buying and reading your book? All three of those?
Well, I really tried in the book to write it for several audiences. First, I wrote it for diplomats because having been in the State Department, having been an ambassador, having worked as Undersecretary of State and others, our Foreign Service officers are superbly trained in the history of the countries they go to, in the language, but not in how to negotiate. So I wanted this to be for them. But second, I also wanted it to be for anyone interested in foreign policy, because this is a history of the last 50 years. And I wanted to do it in a way that put people in the negotiating room so you can feel the pressures that exist on people. And I wanted you to see also how military force can be properly used, as George H.W. Bush did in the Gulf War, how Bill Clinton did with Kosovo and Bosnia, and how it can be misused, as we did in Vietnam. And by the way, in Libya, where, well, Obama said it was his single worst mistake, and in the second Iraq War.
So I read the book. I enjoyed it a great deal. It's an incredibly detailed book about American foreign policy and diplomacy. Congratulations. Do you have any more books ready to go?
I have one more book, and here's the title of it: The Life and Times of David M. Rubenstein.
That'll be a very short book. But Stuart, thank you for doing this. Stuart, are you you're going to sign books? Are you signing books? Or?
I'm going to sign.
All right, Stuart is available
books
to sign books, and it's a great book. Thank you all for coming, and thank the 92nd Street Y for making it possible.